Greetings, fellow do-it-yourselfers. Today we're going to do kind of one of the ultimate do-it-yourself automotive projects. We're going to do an engine swap. In my previous video, I pulled an engine from a salvage yard and tested it to make sure that it is good and ready to plug into this a 90 Toyota Corolla. And the owner of this car made a fatal mistake. Changing the oil, they emptied the oil out but didn't put new oil in. And I wish I could run it for you, but it's been sitting for a long time and the battery's totally dead. And I don't have a spare battery. And besides, I want to make sure the engine doesn't lock up on me or anything like that, because that would complicate matters. I will talk about what to do if you've got a locked up engine that you're trying to pull. But I'm also really pressed for time on this one. I was expecting this car this morning. It's 7 o'clock at night, and I have to get this car out of here tomorrow evening. So this is not going to be a bolt-by-bolt removal of this engine like I was kind of hoping to do. What I'm going to do instead is more of a general approach to removing any engine on a car, and we're going to use the 4AFE in this Corolla as an example, but this will apply to pretty much any engine if you have to do one of these major projects yourself. And I'll just show you some tips on what you can expect if you've never done this before and you're looking to do your first project, or if you've done this before or do this all the time. I'll show you some things I do that I think really make it easier and also a lot more foolproof. So let's go ahead and get started and get this thing up on jack stands and everything. So one of the things that I do, it's a lot easier to install the new engine if the car is level. So you notice that the back of the car here I have on ramps, and then the front of the car I have on jack stands, so I can raise or lower the front of the car as needed. When removing the engine, it's not as big a deal, but I find it much easier if the car is level to replace the new engine, and that's one of the first things that I do. And much like a painting project, a lot of this is about your preparation more so than the execution. So a really good first step, of course, with any major repair, remove the battery. That's the first step on any car you're working on. After that, it depends on the model, on the approach you're going to take. I almost universally go for the radiator next. I think that's a really good first step. It's a little daunting when you look at this thing and you're thinking, wow, where do I even start? But to remove the radiator, that means removing the coolant. So we're going to remove the battery, drain the coolant, and drain the oil. Draining the oil is going to be pretty quick in this one since there is no oil in it, which is why it's here. While that coolant's draining, let's go ahead and take a look at the oil situation here. Again, I don't expect too much to come out of here, but some will since the car's been sitting for a couple months. Won't be 4 quarts, I bet. Oh, that doesn't look like very much. And let's also go ahead and grab a little sample of that right there. You remember in the last video I showed you how to check for metal in the oil, so we're going to go ahead and do that again here. That's pretty much it. I don't think that's enough oil for a car to run very long, do you? All right, well, that gave a new definition to Jiffy Lube, didn't it? But let's take a look at this oil, and I think this time it's going to show up as opposed to that previous video. But if you look at this, that looks like it is absolutely filled with metal particles. Looks like Tinkerbell lives there. It just absolutely is filled with glitter. And it almost looks like a melted milkshake. Not with coolant though, but with bearing particles. So this engine is definitely done for. And now with the coolant drained, the radiator can go ahead and come out next. It's usually where I like to start. And as most models do with automatic transmission, there's going to be 2 coolant lines running to the radiator, and that is for the transmission cooling. And I'm going to go ahead and remove those. And what I also have that I use, I've got these bolts here. So as soon as I unplug that line, it's going to leak some transmission fluid. I'm just going to plug it up with the bolt. There we go. And same with this second transmission line. By the way, free tip for beginners, get yourself a pair of 45-degree and 90-degree pliers, and you will struggle much less with reaching these hose clamps. Much simpler. Take a look at this radiator. This radiator is tremendously dirty. You can barely even see through the thing. So a really good idea is to power wash, or at least use a hose to clean out this radiator. One of the most overlooked things that cause overheating is exactly that, a really dirty radiator. And if your engine failed because of an overheating problem, well, that could be part of the problem right there. So really good time to take care of that. And you can see why I go for the radiator first. It really opens things up a lot, and it's just a great place to start. But we're going to start having a little problem here now. Let's see, here's one connector here. We got this hose where I removed the coolant line. We've got this other hose with the coolant line, and I've also got another connector right here. So it's starting to get to be a problem with all these connectors on where stuff is going to go. So that's what I want to talk about next. So as mentioned earlier, preparation is one of the most important things if you're going to take on a project like this. And one of the main reasons people would avoid taking the project on like this is obviously they're afraid they won't be able to put everything back together again. And that would be a valid concern. So here's a couple things that I do to help with that. The first thing is I have this bolt organizer that I've got labels that I've put in. And these labels are in order that I'm removing any bolts and everything. So any bolts, nuts, small parts, things like that, I'll put into this tray. And then, of course, I can work in reverse order when I put everything back so that I know the sequence that things may have to be assembled so that they can be put together right. And the other thing with any hoses, wires, things like that, connectors, I have 3 colors of tape, white, blue, and red. And what I do generally is start off with anything that I can reach easily, like these spark plug wires or the fan wire here and stuff like that. And I'll label that in white. As I move along, and in some models, for example, you may have to remove the intake manifold to get at connectors that are actually under the intake manifold. And connectors like that, I label with blue tape. The reason being because you obviously do not want to go back and forget about those connectors, put on your intake manifold, and then realize, oh no, now I got to take the intake manifold off to make those connections. So I make those connections in blue. And those blue connector labels remind me to make those connections before I put on an intake manifold or some other major part. And then finally, the red tape is for those things that I didn't notice until I actually start removing the engine. So when I start pulling the engine and you see a ground strap that's right at the back of the firewall or something like that, which is very common, that's very, very difficult to get to with the engine in place. The red connections, when I put the engine back together, I will make those connections first. I'll get the engine into place, make the red connections, then bolt it back up to the transmission. Then, of course, make my blue connections again, and then finally touch off with any white labeled connections. So that's kind of my system, and I think that it works pretty well for me. I highly suggest trying that system if you are doing this for the first time. The other thing is the actual labels themselves. I usually label where the connector goes to, like if it's to an IAT or a throttle position sensor or something like that. One of the things you want to keep in mind is you're going to be swapping this engine. So the trick of labeling one connector A and the other side of the connector A so you match up your A's, well, that's great, but you're going to have to move all those connections over to the new engine, all those labels over to the new engine, so keep that in mind. And then the other thing that I do is I'll always try my best to make the labels so that they will stay in the engine compartment, as opposed to making labels on the engine but then they come out. So I always try to label the engine compartment side of a connector, if that makes sense. And that way I don't worry about losing any of the labels or anything. Another really good step is to clean the engine before you begin. That ensures that your labels don't get too greased up and everything. They don't do you any good if you can't read them after a while, right? So those are some tips to help you stay organized and prepare. So obviously what I'm going to do now is go around with my white tape and label up all the connections that I can easily disconnect. And I'm not exactly going to film that because that'll be pretty boring, but if I were actually to film it, that would be a pretty good part of the next half hour or so, is labeling up all of these connections that I'm removing. However you do this, you also want to make notes, like if different hoses or connections go under a part or over a part or between parts. All kinds of things like that are going to really help you to line up everything better and not wonder, how did that connector get to that destination? Taking photos is a really great idea. Take pictures before you remove a part, before you remove a bunch of connections, or especially hoses. For example, look up here. Now there's a lot of hoses all hooked up here, and it may seem easy to remember where those are going to go, but that may not be the case next weekend if it comes down to that. So you'll want to label up the order that these went in. The best way I would do this is take a picture of it. But again, I can't stress enough, the whole key to putting this engine back together again is how good of a note taker you are, how thorough you've made your labels. And I think also that little labeling trick that I showed you using different colored labels can help out also. But that's up to you to do the labeling so you can put this thing back together again. Even if you've got your vacuum diagram or your wiring diagrams and everything, those don't necessarily help you with telling what path that a wire or a hose took to get to its destination, and that'll help you to prevent things like running wires or hoses near the exhaust, etc. So I'm going to leave it at that, but make sure you take really good notes and spend a lot of time on this because it's going to pay off later. For removing throttle cables, some of them snap on, but for the most part, if you just roll the throttle back, you can just slip the cables right out, like so, and then remove the bolts that hold it to the intake. And these bolts are going to go into throttle in my little holder. And this can just be held out of the way. I usually like to use a small bungee cord or something to hold stuff like this out of the way. I've pretty much got most everything easily reachable labeled up, but I decided to make life easier. I'm just going to go ahead and remove the hood now. It'll make filming easier too and provide a little more light. The hood's got to come off anyway because we're going to need the clearance for the engine hoist. So to remove the hood, the first thing you want to look, and there may be a light, and there's generally some type of windshield washer hoses or something like that. There's just a windshield washer hose here, so I'm going to go ahead and label that up. Again, it seems obvious where it's going to go right now, but remember, if you're doing an engine rebuild or something, it may be 2 months before you're hooking this up again, and you see this hose laying in the corner that doesn't seem to be near a washer pump or anything, and you'll be like, where in the world does this go? Trust me, label up your hoses. The other thing is that the label tape makes them easier to see. With the big mess of spaghetti in here and everything, seeing that big white tape label makes it easier to spot so you don't forget any connections. To get this hood back in the original position, remember, it's very important we line the hood back up because otherwise it won't close properly and won't have the right lines. I'm just going to take a marker and I'm going to mark on the hinges in a couple of spots on each side like that so that I can line up the hood again exactly. Trust me, this is time well spent, because if you don't do this when you go to put that hood back on, it may be a problem lining this back up. You might be lucky and you'll see like where the dirt is, or maybe some rust or the marks where the old bolts were, but don't rely on that. Go ahead and make some marks so that you know you'll be able to put this hood back the way that it was. And it goes without saying, but when removing the hood, you want to be extremely careful of that windshield there. So really, this is easier with two people. But I'm just going to lower the hood so that it can't slip off and hit the windshield, and reach under for my bolts. And also you want to be real careful not to scratch your fenders up. And just take your time with this. There we go. And now I'm going to get this air box out of the way, and that's going to open up a whole bunch of space right over the transmission, and I'm going to formulate a plan at that point on what all needs to come off for me to get to the engine to transmission bolts, which is the whole thing that you're working towards to get that engine and transmission separated. And I'm almost there, but there's a whole bunch of this wire harness in the way. So I think my next objective is to go ahead and try to get this wire harness out of the way. Usually on most models, if you make all the electrical disconnections, you'll be able to just flop the whole harness right out of the way, and I think that's kind of going to be the objective here. So I'm just going to go ahead and start looking where all my electrical connections are, disconnecting them. A lot of times the wire harnesses will be bolted to the engine or frame somewhere, and I'm just going to go ahead and make my objective now to get this wire harness out of the way so I can get a good look at the engine to transmission bolts. And I just wanted to show you, when it comes to electrical connectors, generally, even if you don't label them up real well, an electrical connector will only go to one location. But again, you still want to label them up so that it's faster to find that location. These go to the coil, and also the tape makes it easier to spot. But look here, 2 vacuum hoses. If I didn't label these up, do you think it might be a problem finding out which one went where? Always do your labeling. All right, I've almost got my wiring harness out of the way, but I'm being foiled by the fact that I can't reach this ground connector in here that's behind the alternator. So I'm going to have to remove the alternator to get that, but obviously I want to make sure I connect that wire before I install the alternator when I put the engine in. So I am going to use a blue piece of tape for this connector, and that's going to be a highlight for me to pay attention, and I know that that connector has to go on before the alternator does. And whenever you remove components, if it's something where the orientation of the component might be a little bit of a challenge, usually brackets are like that, but for this alternator, since it can fit in multiple ways and I want to make sure that my connectors will still be accessible, I'm going to label which end is up so that it saves me time when I reinstall it. All right, I should be able to get my wiring harness through now. Now notice there's this branch of the wiring harness that actually fits between runners of the intake manifold. And what I've done is labeled as such so that I know to feed this set through the intake manifold as opposed to over it, again saving me time on the reassembly. So let's see if this will feed through now. Oh, looks like I missed a connector right up here. So I don't want to be lazy. I'm going to label that one up as well, especially since I missed it when it was connected. And let's see if we can feed this through. There we go. All right, and real quick quiz time here. This hose right here, laying off to the right side of the engine, where does it go? It actually goes right here. I know that because of the label. And before I get to the starter, I'm being a little bit foiled by this hose right here. And of course, the clamp is such that I can't reach it with pliers. So a really handy tool to have if you're going to do this is this guy right here. And it's just a long cable with a little gripper right there that you can reach onto the hose And this is awesome for these hard to reach hoses like this. There. Now that would have sucked if I only had pliers. I'm definitely going to put that clamp back on so I'll be able to assemble that easier on the engine install.